Good evening, everyone. I am Brooke Clement. I'm the director here at the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Library and Museum. We're very pleased to be back and open to you all to join us tonight. It's my pleasure to welcome you. The Library and Museum is part of the National Archives and Records Administration, and we are extremely happy to be partnering on the Great Decisions series with the World Affairs Council this season. Before we begin, can you please be sure that your cell phones are turned off or on silent? And while you do that, I'm going to quickly mention one of our upcoming events here at the Ford Museum. Next week, Thursday, one of our archival staff members over in Ann Arbor will be here to talk about Gerald Ford's connection with and contribution to Black History Month. This talk is going to take place in the exhibit gallery at 1 p.m. and is free with museum admission. And it's going to be a very, very busy year here at the Ford Museum. We have several evening programs coming up in March and April. For more information about these and other upcoming programs, please check out our website at fordlibrarymuseum.gov. And now I'm going to introduce Gleaves Whitney, Executive Director of the Ford Presidential Foundation and our great partner.
Well, if we're a great partner, it's because we have a great partner in you and your staff, your team, Brooke. Thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to be here. And I tell you, I'm just happy to see all of you because I think given the December and January we went through and early February, it's kind of important to have a wellness check where we all get to see each other and make sure we're okay. So I'm glad you got out in the beastly weather that we've had. Well, I also want to say how much I value the partnership with the World Affairs Council. It's just been the World Affairs Council of Western Michigan is a natural partner for us. And that's because Gerald Ford was such an international president and congressman. If you go up to this marvelous exhibits upstairs, you will see all of the trips, all of the committees that President and then Congressman Ford engaged in to get to know the world. You know, and I love your motto, you know, to change the world, first you've got to know the world. Well, President Ford took that seriously. And then as president, he was such a key figure. I just want to say something just to situate us why we're here in this auditorium and not some random auditorium out in the city. The World Affairs Council, you know, wanted this partnership as much as we did. And so we thought it'd be just great, because if you go to the other presidential libraries and museums around the country, say you go to the architects of the post-war international order, you go to, say, the FDR in Hyde Park, or if you go to the Truman in Independence, Missouri, you will see the architects of what Joel Westra is going to be talking about. Here you're going to find, when you go to the exhibits between the Oval Office and the Cabinet Room, you are going to, which I think is appropriate, you are going to see the foreign policy of President Ford. He was not the architect, but he was the renovator. He was the renovator of the post-war order. You think about his trip to Beijing to reset the relationship, to steady the relationship with the People's Republic. Think of Helsinki, where he insisted with the Helsinki Final Act on holding the Soviet Union accountable for its human rights violations and get Brezhnev to sign that document. You think of his trip to Rambouillet, the beginning of G6 in those days, and then it grew to G7 and G8, and now we have, what, G100? How many countries are involved? You think of the reset economically, especially at a time when you had currency tumult and you had oil shocks. It was really important. And then you think of his Middle Eastern diplomacy and how important it was for him to be involved in the Arab-Israeli talks after a number of wars. So you definitely have a renovator in Ford who was very sharp in his knowledge of world affairs and loved partnerships. And so we love our partnership with the World Affairs Council of Western Michigan and with the Ford Presidential Library and Museum. And now I'd like to invite to the podium Dr. Erica Kubik, who is one of the leaders there, works closely with Michael Van Dennen to run the World Affairs Council. Erica, come on up. Let's give her a hand.
Well, right back at you, Gleaves and Brooke. We love our partnership with the Ford Museum and Library and the Foundation. And truly, we think of ourselves as an organization for this community to invite anyone who wants to know about the world to come join us in discussion and dialogue. So we're so happy that you're here tonight. As Gleaves mentioned, I'm Erica Kubik. I'm the Director of Programming for the Council. On behalf of my colleagues, Michael Van Denen, Rachel Brooks, Abigail Stead, as well as our Board of Directors, thank you so much for being here tonight. We are so pleased to have this partnership, so let me just say thank you again to the Ford Museum, as well as the Presidential Foundation, but also to the museum staff and GRCC who are helping us record this program and get these programs on our YouTube channel so that we can expand our impact. And so if you are intrigued by the conversations tonight and you want to share what you learned, please, when these become available, we encourage you to share and broaden our impact. As Gleaves mentioned, to change the world, we believe one must first know the world. So if you want to learn more about us, you can head over to worldmichigan.org to check out more about what we do. I also want to say thank you to WGVU Public Media. They're our presenting media sponsor, as well as the Community Media Center as our communication partner. Now let me introduce our presenter for the evening. You probably all know him and are very fond of the work that he does. He is a professor, Joel Westra is a professor at Calvin University here in Grand Rapids, and he's the chair of the Politics and Economics Department. He is a great friend of our council. He's served as a moderator for many of our presentations on stage throughout the years. He also serves on our Faculty Great Decisions Committee, along with many others from surrounding colleges and universities. And we couldn't do what we do without the academic expertise that comes from these wonderful individuals. Professor Westra joined Calvin faculty in 2007. And he's directed Calvin's pre-law program since 2008. He earned his bachelor's degree from the University of Houston and his master's and doctoral degrees from the University of Chicago. And, when this topic came up as one from the Foreign Policy Association, looking at international orders, my first thought was, boy, I bet Dr. Westra knows a lot about this. So let me share his teaching and research interests. They include international organizations and law, international security, international relations theory, and U.S. foreign policy. His research focuses on multilateral and regional security institutions as instruments of international order, specifically on questions pertaining to institutional design and to mechanisms of legitimation and restraint on the use of armed forces within the international system. He's the author of a number of articles, reviews, and data sets related to international law, multinational organizations, and the UN Charter System. His presentation tonight is titled, Can the Post-World War II International Order Survive in the 21st Century? Let's all give a round of applause for Dr. Joel Westra.
Thank you, Erica, for the kind introduction, and thank you, Gleaves, for what is actually a very good prelude to the conversation tonight. And thank you to all of you who are here in the audience tonight. It's an honor to be part of this lecture series, and it's a privilege to have the opportunity tonight to discuss such an important topic with you. This topic has received a lot of attention at Davos last month and at the Munich Security Conference last week, and I'll try to make some reference to that in my remarks as well. I know from experience that you are an informed and attentive and inquisitive audience, so I especially look forward to the conversation that will follow. Despite the expansiveness of the topic, I'll do my best to keep it within bounds so that we have time for that conversation. At the close of World War II, the United States and its wartime allies met at conferences in Washington, Moscow, and Tehran in 1943, at Dumbarton Oaks in 1944, and at San Francisco in 1945 for purposes of post-war planning, drafting what eventually became the Charter of the United Nations. The Charter was to serve as a foundation for post-war international order by codifying basic rules of state interaction, limiting states' use of military force, and committing states to undertake joint action to address threats to international peace and security. In establishing the United Nations, the major powers sought to instantiate and sustain ordered patterns of interaction and expectations that both reflected shared interests but also acknowledged power disparities. Because they were generally satisfied with their relative power positions as they emerged after the war, the system of order that emerged along with that embodied that disposition. The UN Charter was a consequence of unique historical circumstances that faced the Allied powers at the end of World War II. As recognized by the post-war planners, creating a generally acceptable system of order would require accommodating the interests of less powerful states and also recognizing the increased importance of states that were emerging from colonialism. Under the terms of the Charter, less powerful states obtained a commitment from the major powers not to use armed force against them, except when acting in individual or collective self-defense, or for purposes consistent with those of the United Nations. In return, the major powers obtained a commitment from less powerful states not to use armed force to change the existing balance of power, as it happened at the end of World War I, and acceptance of the major powers' privileged positions within the Security Council, and the Security Council's primacy within the United Nations organization. This bargain then reflected a more general trade-off regarding state sovereignty, preserving sovereignty by prohibiting threats or uses of armed force against the territorial integrity or political independence of states, and preserving states' inherent right of self-defense, while also constraining sovereignty by limiting the circumstances under which states could use military force. This foundational bargain set the stage for broader cooperation facilitated by the General Assembly and by the Economic and Social Council. However, the only operative institutions established under the Charter were security institutions, as had been envisioned during the early post-war planning conferences. It wasn't until later, largely due to the pressure from less powerful states, that broader aspects of international order were considered and an aspirational preamble was added. Major power delegates at Dunbar and Oaks believed, in their words, that this relatively innocuous aspirational language might help the operative peace and security arrangements be more broadly accepted. That aspirational language, however, reflected shared norms and shaped the post-war order that emerged over the following decades. We refer to the post-war international order then to be both the institutional arrangements that emerged after the war and beyond, and the patterns of international interaction that maintain and are instantiated within that order. So there are two key points to consider here. And the first is that security is foundational to international order. And the second is that systems of order comprise both operative and aspirational components, with each mattering in different ways. And Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, if you saw his remarks at Davos, one of the things they did was capture both of these aspects of systems of order. States subsequently have built upon the foundation provided by the UN Charter, constructing an institutional architecture of multilateral organizations and treaty law governing specific issue areas. So resulting systems of order have included a broader international security order, an international economic order, an international humanitarian order, eventually an international environmental order, and all of this alongside a set of technical agreements and coordinating bodies. And what has been achieved since World War II is an extraordinary extent of global governance, addressing a broad scope of issues via institutional arrangements that have been accepted by most states. And we can consider each of these systems of post-war order in turn. As we've already noted, the institutional architecture of the post-war security order rests directly on the foundation provided by the UN Charter. The Charter itself provides foundational international law pertaining to the use of armed force, and the Security Council exercises supranational authority over all international peace and security issues. Building upon this foundation, subsequent efforts by states during and after the Cold War resulted in a series of regimes governing specific areas of international security. These include an interstate conflict regime comprising mostly regional arrangements and a set of treaties governing specific domains, an interstate and transnational conflict regime, that is governing interaction between states and non-state actors such as terrorists, pirates, criminal gangs, insurgents. This is also primarily a set of regional arrangements. And finally, a non-proliferation and arms control regime, which comprises an extensive set of treaties governing specific domains. The emergence of these arrangements was facilitated by mostly shared major power leadership. And we can see this in the operative design of these arrangements. In terms of the interstate conflict regime, we see a reflection of the existing power structure in the Security Council explicitly with its permanent membership, also in NATO implicitly with the roles reserved for the United States. We also see an acknowledgement, at least tacitly, of spheres of influence within the regional organizations as they fit into the United Nations organization under Article 52 of the Charter. This is similar also to the interstate transnational conflict regime in the Security Council explicitly, and as we'll talk about more later, by extension in the International Criminal Court, over which the Security Council exercises some authority. The non-proliferation and arms control regime also reflects this structure in terms of the Security Council again, but also in terms of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which specifies 5 nuclear weapon states and everyone else as non-nuclear weapon states. The design of these arrangements also reflects concerns about state sovereignty. And so we see within them then a set really of imprecise obligations, usually. And that is to say they prescribe general tendencies or dispositions, but they don't really prescribe specific activities or actions that you can clearly point to and say, that crossed the line. This looks somewhat different in terms of non-proliferation arms control agreements, which contain more precise obligations. They're more technical agreements, of course, and they usually allow for monitoring and verification, but they tend to lack explicit enforcement mechanisms. So enforcement tends to go back to the Security Council, where the major powers play a primary role. Despite their shortcomings, these arrangements have contributed to the functioning of international order. In terms of interstate conflict, although the Security Council often was hindered by Cold War rivalry and by collective action problems, it served to increase predictability and reduce uncertainty by creating an expectation of compliance with a set of agreed rules and subjecting uses of force to scrutiny in terms of those rules. And this tended to elicit some restraint even from the major powers, which were hoping and attempting to signal their continuing commitment to the existing order and therefore not as threatening to that order and to states' positions within that order. The Security Council, especially post-Cold War, helped to facilitate collective action. Despite all this, though, we must acknowledge that the aspiration of saving succeeding generations from the scourge of war always remained an aspiration. Likewise, from its beginning, NATO was plagued by concerns of European allies free riding on the United States. Nonetheless, it played an important role in helping to ensure a credible U.S. security commitment to Europe, thereby facilitating European integration and reducing uncertainty among European states. The institutions comprising the interstate and transnational conflict regime were similarly hindered by the Cold War, but further were hindered by concerns regarding post-colonial conflict, questions of self-determination, and of course, collective action problems. And so with their typically low level of obligation, these have remained by comparison more aspirational. In terms of non-proliferation and arms control, there always has been a difficulty of monitoring. Nonetheless, these have tended to facilitate some collective action, again, by creating clear standards against which behavior could be compared. And they've helped to stabilize the status quo and reveal information about states' actual capabilities. And this is the case even if the goal of complete and total disarmament remains aspirational. An international economic order was established at the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference, which created an international monetary fund as the basis of a post-war balance of payments regime, and the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development as the basis for a post-war finance and development regime. This emerging system of economic order was strengthened subsequently at the United Nations Conference on Trade and Employment by the establishment of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, a complementary institution that served as the basis of a post-war trade regime. Within this system of order, the GATT, the IMF, and the World Bank are forming a secondary foundation built upon the underlying UN Charter framework. Building upon this foundation, subsequent efforts by states during the Cold War resulted in a balance of payments regime to address exchange rates and concerns about financial stability. This is mostly comprised informal arrangements of various sorts, such as the G7 or the G20. A finance and development regime to enable emerging states to participate in a globalized economy. This has included a number of arrangements, including what we now know as the World Bank Group. And finally, the international trade regime continued to develop within the GATT through trade rounds, culminating in 1995 with the establishment of the WTO, the goal here being to facilitate economic liberalization through trade. As with the security order, the emergence of these arrangements was facilitated by major power leadership, though often not shared here, as the Soviet Union was opted out of these arrangements throughout the Cold War. And as before, we can see this in the operative design of these arrangements. In terms of the balance of payments regime and the finance and development regime, the governing structure of the IMF and the World Bank is shared. And within that, the United States has an effective veto. That is to say, it has enough votes that on its own, it can vote down any other proposal. The designs here also reflected concerns about state sovereignty, as we would expect. In terms of the balance of payments regime, the IMF contains imprecise obligations. It's really a matter of principles rather than clear rules about what's allowed or not allowed for a state's exchange rate policy. The international trade regime, the obligations are quite limited. What makes trade law so complicated are the number of allowed exceptions within the GATT framework. There's also limited enforcement of international trade, although this was improved with the creation of the WTO. As you know, the system remains imperfect. Nonetheless, despite their shortcomings, these arrangements also contributed to the functioning of an international order. The balance of payments regime was limited throughout the Cold War by Soviet non-participation, yet it served as a stabilizing factor. It facilitated and maintained the dominance of the US dollar as the world's primary reserve and transaction currency. It eventually encouraged capital mobility, facilitated economic interdependence. It also encouraged domestic reform, which in some cases at least contributed to financial stability. Though there are controversies here we'll talk about later in the program. The finance and development regime, again limited by Cold War rivalry, Soviet non-participation, and yet it facilitated collective action and pooling of resources, leading to the development of infrastructure, and in some instances, beneficial domestic reform. We can acknowledge, though, that the goals, including those specified as Millennial Development Goals, remain aspirational here. And finally, the trade regime, also limited throughout the Cold War by rivalry and Soviet non-participation, but it facilitated extensive trade liberalization, economic interdependence, and most importantly, perhaps, stability and predictability of states' interactions within the trading system. Nonetheless, trade disputes remain frequent, and the ultimate goal of freer and fairer trade has and does remain aspirational here. An international humanitarian order was also established by the UN General Assembly and the Economic and Social Council through the creation of the United Nations Commission on Human Rights and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as the basis of a human rights regime, and through the creation of the International Refugee Organization and Convention relating to the status of refugees as the basis of a refugees regime. This emerging system of order was expanded at the Geneva Conferences through the creation of the 1949 Geneva Conventions as the basis of a non-combatant humanitarian law regime. Building upon this foundation, subsequent efforts by states during the Cold War resulted in expansion and creation of a fuller human rights regime. This comprises various human rights conventions, the emergence ultimately of the principle of responsibility to protect, and the creation of a human rights council. And here we have actually a picture of Ford at Helsinki, and basket 3 at Helsinki, of course, is human rights. In terms of constructing the refugees regime, the most important additional part here was the protocol in 1967 that took the initial refugees convention that applied solely to Europe after World War II and extended it globally with a set of principles and rules for states. And finally, in terms of the non-combatant humanitarian law regime, we see building upon the initial Geneva Conventions, a set of additional protocols, and ultimately the Rome Statute and the creation of an international criminal court. As before, the operative design of these arrangements reflect concerns about state sovereignty as well. In terms of the human rights regime, we see imprecise obligation here again. We have typically principles and dispositions that are accompanied by unspecified commitments to take some action. There also is a lack of direct enforcement. R2P principle was supposed to address that. It, of course, though, reflects power disparities in that the R2P principle functions through decision by the Security Council to enforce human rights violations under R2P. In terms of the refugees regime, we also here, quite importantly, have imprecise obligations. States are obligated to consider asylum claims of individuals, but nothing is specified about how that should be done within states. It's implemented differently by states, and there's no clear system of enforcement here either. Finally, in terms of non-combatant humanitarian law, the obligation is unfortunately quite low because everything makes allowances for the overarching principle of military necessity. And to the extent, that the International Criminal Court can exercise authority here, its jurisdiction is limited by time, by place, and by whether states have ratified the Rome Statute. So as a result, by comparison to the economic order and the security order, the humanitarian order has remained the most aspirational to this point. Within the human rights regime, we see widespread ratification or accession to human rights treaties, but not widespread compliance with those treaties. We can note that as any treaty, there's created an expectation of compliance and a set of standards for scrutiny. However, as I've already noted, the standards here are imprecise, and perhaps more importantly, there's not the same incentive for other states to enforce the rules, to respond to violations of human rights, because those don't affect their sovereignty, and in fact could risk sovereignty because they interfere with the fundamental relationship between state and citizen. So the incentives here are very different than in a security order where states feel violations as threats to their sovereignty and have incentive to respond, even if they'd rather free ride on someone else to pay the cost of doing so. In terms of the Human Rights Council, if you know much about it, you know it routinely is comprised of states with poor human rights records, spends most of its time focusing on Israel and not many other issues. In terms of the International Criminal Court, the United States signed the Rome Statute but never ratified it. China did not sign the statute. Russia withdrew. Israel removed its signature. Palestine signed, never ratified, but is treated as a party, which has made other states upset about it as well. So the Human Rights Council and the ICC have not functioned very effectively here at all, and this is on the basis of a set of rather imprecise treaties, unfortunately. Within the refugees regime, the functioning really is limited by free riding. A state can agree to, in principle, that refugees should be granted asylum, but every state has incentive to have someone else pay for that and grant that. And you see that very clearly. In terms of non-combatant humanitarian law, the biggest functional aspect of this is much of the Geneva Conventions have been incorporated into military training and field manuals, including US military training. However, there's a lack of enforcement, and the ICC is plagued by similar problems here as in human rights areas as well. An international environmental order was established at the United Nations Conference on the Human Environment in 1972 through the creation of the UN Environment Program. The environmental order includes 6 interrelated regimes governing various areas of environmental concern. Of note here, perhaps most recently, we had the establishment of the High Seas Treaty, which governs the marine environment. And in terms of global climate change, the Paris Agreement, which is a protocol to an earlier framework agreement, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. A much later system and a much more complex system. Progress here has been hindered by lack of major power leadership and, as always, concerns about sovereignty and distribution of benefits. A few notes here. In terms of the marine environment, we've seen some progress, both the Law of the Seas Treaty and the High Seas Treaty. Both of these, unfortunately, though, have quite imprecise obligations about just what must states do or not do in terms of preserving and protecting the marine environment. And the United States, notably, is not a participant in the Law of the Sea Treaty. It complies and benefits from the military aspects of it, but not the environmental and natural resource aspects of it. In terms of ozone pollution, we've had some success. This is actually one of the better success stories in terms of the international environmental order with addressing CFCs and ozone depletion. Where we've seen far less progress, of course, is in the area of greenhouse gases, where, again, we have US non-participation, we have free riding, and the Paris Agreement, for all the progress it has made, is a completely non-binding agreement even for those states that commit themselves to it. In terms of fisheries resources, these have been hindered functionally by collective action problems. They're mostly regional, and within those regions, states typically have set their limits far too high to be effective on maintaining fish stocks. So we have here a much more aspirational system of order as well. Nonetheless, in this quick march through what we call the post-war order, we've seen this combination of both functional and aspirational components, and these have shaped expectations and interactions among states. Nonetheless, the world is changing quickly, and that's the question before us. Where do things go from here? And I want to look at each of these again in turn about what has been happening and where does that leave us. Firstly, in terms of the security order, we've had numerous challenges and controversies, especially since the end of the Cold War. I would suggest to you that the ones I have listed here, though, they reflect an attenuation, but a still functioning security order. And let me explain what I mean by that. Controversial though it was in the Iraq War, it came after an extended period of multilateral negotiation. It followed what was a permissive Security Council resolution threatening serious action in response to Iraq's continued non-compliance with the terms of its ceasefire agreement. The Kosovo conflict was similar, although it ended up being a post hoc justification under a later Security Council resolution. In terms of Panama, in terms of Iran, and its support of the so-called axis of resistance. In both instances, we had powerful states noting a claim of self-defense. In Panama, this followed attacks against US personnel, a claim by the legislative branch of Panama that a state of war existed, an invitation by a democratically elected president. For Iran, the principle is self-determination, self-defense, and Iran is very careful not to be so connected that it can claim to have effective control. Ukraine looks, up to 2022, looked a lot like a Cold War conflict. Indirect, covert, following a referendum that claimed self-determination of a group to secede. And in terms of these grave non-proliferation challenges, India and Pakistan never signed the NPT. North Korea withdrew from it. Iran is still part of the NPT. There's never been evidence it actually has a weapons program. It has a nuclear enrichment program. So in each of these, we have states trying to stay within the bounds, and the result is less unpredictability than we might otherwise have had. But the problem is that over the same period, we've had stagnation and even reversal of the institutional architecture. In terms of challenges for non-proliferation, for arms control, for dealing with emerging and increasingly common transnational conflict, we haven't seen much major power leadership in actually changing and adapting to a changing world. In terms of interstate conflict, we've seen significant challenges to NATO beginning in 2018 with the United States under President Trump not willing to acknowledge and affirm the collective defense commitment under Article 5. And just recently in 2026, the United States announcing that it will no longer participate in certain NATO groups and will bring personnel home as they rotate out from those groups. But beyond that, though, there are things I believe are, at least potentially, ruptures here in the system. In terms of interstate conflict, once we reach 2022, we have a cross-border invasion with no claim whatsoever under international law, not even an attempt. In Greenland, similarly, we had the United States of America claiming it needs Greenland for its own security, making threats against its NATO allies at that point. We have the looming possibility of a China-Taiwan conflict and a proposed board of peace to replace the Security Council with a group of non-appointed men, not states, who would preside over the international order. In terms of interstate transnational conflict, Venezuela, we have a military operation to capture a head of state only justified under domestic criminal law as a wanted criminal. And in terms of non-proliferation, arms control, we have an abandonment, really, of the arms control framework, beginning with ABM, with the United States developing missile defenses, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty in the face of Russian violation, and finally, just last week, the New START Treaty ended, and no effort to move forward, no effort to engage in further arms control. There are no remaining nuclear arms control agreements from the Cold War in operation. In terms of the economic order, we can trace a similar set of pathways. The biggest challenge here probably was under President Nixon in 1971, removing the dollar from the gold standard, from convertibility, and threatening what he called a surcharge, a retaliatory tariff against states that would devalue their own currencies in response. But what's really interesting here, when you go into the archival record, was Nixon, for as much as he wanted to make this bold move, didn't want to go too far out and tear up everything. And so these negotiations actually happened within the IMF, achieved a devaluation of the dollar under the Smithsonian Agreement, and the justification for the tariffs was actually an allowed exception under GATT rules for exchange rate emergencies. In terms of the US-China trade war, where things started, it also looked like that. These were allowed exceptions, very big exceptions, but nonetheless allowed for national security and for retaliation against violations or perceived violations of trade rules. And then in the midst of this, we have the controversies we all know of how the IMF and World Bank have responded to crises, how the missteps they've made along the way in addressing problems of development. And as with the security institutions, this becomes worse as we see stagnation or reversal setting in. Instead of addressing these problems, we've seen very little movement over the last decade or so. The most recent WTO trade round has been stalled. for over a decade after it was launched in 2001, deadlocked over concern of intellectual property, subsidies, technology transfer, agriculture. But here too, we see ruptures. And the big ruptures here are in the WTO appellate panel and in the Liberation Day tariffs. Since 2019, the United States, under President Trump and President Biden, has not allowed members to be appointed to the appellate panel to replace those whose terms have expired. This means now that the trade war is going on with no referees by design. And most troublingly, perhaps, the Liberation Day tariffs, which explicitly replaced the GATT principle of unconditional reciprocity with conditional reciprocity. But I have reciprocity here in quotation marks because it's not clear what's being reciprocated. It's not actually tariffs. It's deficits, it's other financial demands. And alongside of this, lessening confidence in the US dollar in the face of a declared policy of a weaker dollar, in the face of out-of-control spending, debt, and inflation. And we're seeing movement then of central banks to reduce the dollars in their reserves. We've seen some weaker demand of US Treasuries auctions. In terms of the humanitarian order, we've had a lot of recent challenges here as well, although again, early on there are some efforts to put the actions within the bounds. In both Afghanistan and in terms of drug boats, stretched as it is, there's an effort to say these are unlawful enemy combatants and therefore not deserving of the same rights of combatants by states. And Israel, though accused of disproportionality, has claimed its actions are discriminate, and there's an overarching doctrine of military necessity. But the same pattern repeats itself here. We just haven't seen effort to build on a refugee system that is widely said to be broken, a human rights council that's ineffective, a set of rules about humanitarian limits of the use of force that aren't really adequate to the challenges of transnational conflict, and the declared end of R2P during the crisis in Syria in 2011 and 12, of Syria using chemical weapons against its own people. The rupture here that I see, though, is in the refugee system, where asylum seekers, you no longer hear that term. States are generally only talking about illegal aliens. And the fundamental principle of non-refoulement, which says you cannot return an asylum seeker to the country from which he or she came or to another place in which there will not be safety, has been thrown away entirely in terms of just deporting of illegal aliens. So we have ruptures. To bring this to a close, where is this all coming from? And part of what we have to understand is the whole system is built on a premise that states are reasonably satisfied with the world as it is, with the status quo. And these rules then enable them to enhance stability of predictability of actions within that. As that changes, everything changes with it. And as Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney said at Davos, for decades we participated, but it no longer works. So what has been going on? Part of this has been really a rising populist and anti-globalist backlash against some of the limitations and failures within the international economic order. Decades of financial crises, controversial responses to that, hollowing out of industry and states as they participated in the global trading system. And that in turn makes it harder for states like the United States to exercise leadership. They're constrained domestically. Underneath that, we also have shifting power, and as power shifts, concerns about distribution of gains within the system of order become more and more acute. And then to exacerbate that, it's accompanied by emerging technologies, a changing global climate, which make those distributional concerns and claims even more difficult to overcome. And we also lack a singular focusing event to say, how are we going to push past this? The sort of event that launched this whole system, 1943, 44, 45. So what then will the future look like? To the extent that aspirational components of the existing order are undermined, we should expect to see more, unfortunately, stagnation and reversal in institutional arrangements. To the extent that the operative components are weakening, we should expect to see more uncertainty, instability, unpredictability, and crisis. But in the longer term, I want to suggest 3 scenarios to consider. One is a 1930s redux. And as a snapshot, this looks similar to what we're seeing today. Rising populism, rising nationalism, rejection of the existing system of order, and resulting upheaval. Historically, this, of course, is offset because we know what happened after that, which might push back against this. Nonetheless, if you read the latest national security strategy of the United States, it declares firmly the days of the United States propping up the entire world order, like Atlas, are over. Second possibility is more of a late 1940s redux, the possibility of a reestablishment, a renewal of the existing system of order. Remember, this is the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union negotiating this together. There were compromises. There were things worked out in response to a global crisis. So what we could start to see then is perhaps a G2 sort of arrangement of the United States re-engaging with China. Obvious advantages of that are continuity and familiarity. Disadvantages, though, are it would be less aligned with U.S. interests, less aligned with U.S. values, more really compromise, less cooperation, probably. Final possibility could be a 1970s redux or a 1920s redux. What do I mean here? One thing that happened in the 1970s, and it's illustrated a little bit with the Nixon shock I talked about, it's illustrated militarily, an effort by middle powers to renegotiate some of the terms of the existing order, move it forward, make some concessions to the major powers. Or it could be something like the 1920s, where groups of states each go their own way and establish sets of regional orders to one extent or the other. This is what Mark Carney was capturing in his remarks at Davos. The middle powers get together, build something new. Where are we going now? Which of these? We can see signs of all of them. It's too early to tell, but as I say to my students, we will see this experiment play out in our lifetimes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joel. Appreciate it. Got a lot to think about here. I'm Michael Van Dennen. I'm the director of the council, and it's time now for your participation. Questions of our presenter and thoughts for us to think about. If you'd like to text those, you can do that at 616-308-6560. Got it. And you know our house rules, succinct question. Asked respectfully, right? Got a question here?
Thank you. What would you say are the main causes for the populist and anti-global backlash? Because if you look at it objectively, there's been so many great benefits to it. And in the US, I see so many people whose lives are statistically better than they were 50 years ago, just so bent on that their life is not doing well and like everything's got to change. And to me, it's so bonkers, and it's upsetting to see that it's the #1 reason on your list. So I just wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Well, I think ironically, and your question picks up on this, it's a consequence both of the successes and the failures of the existing system of order. Start with the failures because that's the easier one to see. The extent to which economic globalization has not been a smooth ride, has not been a comfortable ride for everyone. Political scientist Robert Cohen has a great statement on this. He says that economic adjustment, that is the way economies adjust to trade and integration, is an economic good but a political bad, that those who are not benefiting want to see change. And along the way, you could think about that as a developed world concern hollowing out of industry. We hear about that a lot in the Midwest. On the other side of this, really a majority world concern, how has the IMF, how has the World Bank actually made things better? And so on that end, you see the limitations, the shortcomings, and a reassertion of saying the order doesn't work. This bargain of giving up some sovereignty doesn't work. We want it back. On the other hand, you can't even get to those sorts of concerns without the system having worked to some extent, created shifts, created changes, and even created the point at which states were willing to give up some of that sovereignty, be constrained in their decision-making. But that, of course, gives then people who aren't, or at least feel they aren't being well served by the system, something to point to. Not only the system hasn't worked, but why are we paying for this? Why are we allowing decisions to be made over which we don't have direct accountability? So it's a combination of all of those things. And I think, too, something that's a little more subtle here, which I alluded to, is it makes it harder then to move forward. But if there could be better movement forward to start to acknowledge these are the places that the system hasn't worked well, what else can be done, that would be a remedy. But to get to that remedy, you have to overcome this pillar of rising nationalism, rising anti-globalism.
My question is sort of following up with that, but I think from the outside looking in, it seems that this current administration has made such drastic changes of withdrawing from treaties and organizations. It seems to be really catalyzing this. Do you think that we were headed towards this shift globally, regardless of the outcome of last election? Do you think we would have been on this path if the election outcomes had been different, or were we already headed that way?
I think in a broad sense, the path is set. And there are a couple ways to think about that. One is, this is not just a US trend. Now, the United States plays a tremendous role in the direction of the international order, but it's not just a US trend. We're seeing these same sorts of concerns, complaints elsewhere in the world. We're also seeing a complementary set of complaints, not quite the same, but Russia and China aren't satisfied for different reasons with the order. Within the United States, Trump is very interesting to look at because there's such drama, there's such flair, there's such quickness. But underneath it, I'm reminded, I don't know if it's still there, but many times driving out on the highway from Grand Rapids, you would pass a billboard that said, "Get us out of the UN." So a very anti-globalist sentiment. If you think about how President Biden ran successfully for president, how Secretary Clinton ran unsuccessfully for president, it was in part, a very populist economic message that these sorts of systems aren't working. As I noted in my remarks, the Biden administration had a very different tone and a way of framing it, but still was not going to allow the appellate panel of the WTO to make decisions about US trade policy. So we get probably a more dramatic shift, probably a quicker shift. But I don't think that the election itself is determinative. I think it's affecting when and how quickly. But underneath that too, people were voting for this, and many people who voted that way are cheering for this. Not all of it, perhaps, but even something like refugees. How many people in the United States, how many people in this room have ever heard of the principle of non-refoulement? Almost no one, right? But on the other hand, is the consideration, well, we should have a system for asylum and so forth? It's no, the system's not working and there shouldn't be people here coming and taking what's ours. So all I say, I think there are deeper structural forces at work here, and we can't put too much on the turn of just one election.
With the escalation of terrorism and terrorist groups in the 21st century, I'm curious whether, in your opinion, there are effective changes that could be made to the United Nations Charter or the architectural structures that you've discussed tonight that would be effective in counteracting the confrontation from traditional non-governmental states that exist out there?
Well, there are two big problems here. One, as you note, is the architecture itself. That really wasn't foreseen. And part of the reason it wasn't foreseen was the technological capabilities of today didn't exist then. It was very hard to be a militarily effective non-state actor. The closest we got to see is as the Cold War heated up, by the time we were to the 70s, the great diffusion of small arms and light weapons. But even that was quite a bit later. And now, just the way societies are interconnected and vulnerable, that's a hard challenge. So we had that difficulty of not seeing what was coming and the technology that drives it. And so it's a difficult one to solve for both those reasons. But if you go back 25 years, about 30 years actually, so a period from about 1995 to 2005, states were working on this really hard. And there were a series of what ended up being, I think it was 14 different treaties were being negotiated. And what they were incrementally getting towards was, how can we create a set of standards that we can agree upon of which actors can be treated in which way? And so I say, okay, 14 treaties, you've probably heard of none of them, you can't see an effect. But what was going on was a very careful negotiation regarding this really complicated question of post-colonialism, of self-determination. Can we get to the point where we think about these sorts of actors by their actions, not by their political goal? And a lot of progress was made towards that. That's a problem you have to overcome before you then can get to the operative problem of what do you actually do about it. 2005 was the end of that effort. So it's kind of been a generation squandered of starting to put political actors together and say, now that we've gotten the preliminary mostly squared away, let's try to figure out how to deal with this much more challenging issue. So it doesn't fully answer your question, but I hope it gives you some context.
Okay, so I have a question. So with the rise of populist movements, there appears to be growing skepticism towards spec knowledge and a rise of anti-intellectualism in some sense. So how can social and political order be sustained when trust in data weakens and historical understanding fades?
That's a very good question. Very, very good question. Let me think of how I would approach that. Part of that, which is tangential, not a full answer, I admit, but part of that is looking back at some of the things I pointed out as challenges. You can point to several of those, and people can rightly say, the experts told me this would work, and it didn't, economically, militarily, and so forth. So that starts to drive then a willingness to believe other things, not to trust the experts. And an interesting way this came out, one of the ways this has come out has been interesting, of these challenges of climate change and then the role of the World Health Organization in coordinating responses to global health. So it shows up on a global level. It also shows up in the sorts of leaders who are elected. The best answer I've come to is sort of the longer term answer, and it's the best I've come up with, which maybe will give you hope, maybe not, is these sorts of engagements, bringing people together, acknowledging these are the limitations, these are the shortcomings, these are the blunders. This is what was attempted here that was promising. Trying to meet people where they're at and acknowledge those shortcomings first, could become a space in which you can facilitate the sort of conversation that could start to renew trust. But that's a very limited answer to what's a very good and complicated question.
All right, so kind of follow up a little bit with the modernity and the whole anti-knowledge, or actually the intellectualism. So we had talked a lot about different conflicts and having like common understandings, especially when it came down to human rights and things like that. But do you think we'll see a shift, or at least a framework, maybe in our lifetime, where a digital world, and a digital standard kind of becomes that, right? We've seen misinformation from Russia, from China, from Korea, the US, Brazil. I mean, we've got a lot of actors with a lot of hands in the pot and not a lot of great interest.
So as I think about this, a lot of what these systems were built on, and this came out, I think, over and over and over in my talk, was not so much to say, all right, let's create clearer and more detailed rules we'll all agree on and we'll never deviate from. But it was more, let's gradually bring in the boundaries. And we understand, and the whole system of international law is built on this, with reservations allowed to treaties, and some states comply with this and not that. But even those who are within, some of them are going to be along the edges and saying, this is how I interpret this, you interpret it that way. What I'm getting at is it's not really a technical problem, because much of the controversy is not what happened. It's which rule applies, how does it apply, does this count, does that count? And if you wanted to bring that, make that a tighter alignment, make it look more like a domestic system, the world's not going to be ready for that for a long time. Different states have very competing interests, very different understandings of themselves. So I don't think a technical solution on that level will work. Where technical solutions do work, and this gets back to the previous question, is in building up an agreed knowledge just about what is the reality out there, especially as we think about environmental challenges, somewhat secondarily, but still important, I think, of humanitarian and development challenges. And that's hard to get to now because there's so much mistrust on that. But where the technical solution, I think, will come in is helping actors to understand the nature of the reality they're facing, not so much in being able to make clearer calls, yes, no, did this fall within the bounds of the rules?
You got three options, as it were, listed there. Two-part question. Are those the only options? And if so, which one's the most preferable?
So one I didn't leave on here. And if I'd had the full 3 hours to pontificate on this the way I was fully thinking of in my mind, the option that's not on here that I think is the least plausible is the 1990s redux. What was interesting about the 1990s is progress was being made in so many ways. The Cold War ended, and suddenly there was this big push to let's start stitching this together, let's start stitching that together. And that was a very optimistic period. I think that one's not at all on the table right now. That's the fourth one not there. I'm glad you haven't pushed me more on which of these I think is the most likely now, because I'm still not sure. This is the most stable one, and what a 1940s redux would look like would not be very parallel in saying let's establish something that's very broad and far-ranging, and quite frankly, we tend to refer to this as the liberal international order. The United States was very dominant in shaping the norms that did this, but it would be more of a sitting down and saying, all right, China's got a new place in the world has changed. What now could be the minimally acceptable set of rules that we could start to build on, and maybe at some point in the future that would reach a 1990s redux. So I think this has its problems. It would be a less liberal order, a less comprehensive order, but the most stable option of these three, in my mind.
Earlier, you spoke a lot about the United Nations My question is the United Nations a viable institution as long as the 5 original powers can veto anything?
So that's the most common criticism, and it's the most trenchant criticism. What was interesting to note in the debates that were going on at San Francisco is they were putting the final version together and had to get many states on board to get at this. A lot of states said, this is a non-starter. You've given 5 states the ability to veto anything. And the response that was given, and it actually satisfied most of the delegates there, they ratified the charter, was that if those 5 are strongly opposed to this thing, it's not going to succeed anyway. And so the argument was, it's not the framework, it's what the actors want. And that's the way I've tended to think about this. When did the UN work the worst? Early Cold War was a mess. The Soviet Union was vetoing everything. 1990s, it worked pretty well. Same arrangement. What changed? How closely the actors could align. Now, it gets more complicated because you can't frame the world as neatly as you could then about who should have that and who shouldn't. And what's been interesting to me is that was a big debate in the 1990s too, and it's kind of died down, I think, because so many people are seeing all these other cracks forming in the order, and the question of should we change the veto or something is fading into the background. And so all that to say, I think that rule or that structure matters less than the reality that's behind it, that the powerful states in the system really are kind of losing their interest in working within this agreed framework or in adapting it. And until that's addressed, the veto is a secondary issue, in my mind at least.
Go ahead. Hi. I want to push back a little bit on your answer to this young woman here, because I think that Kamala Harris would have been a very different force at the UN. And I also think that, Donald Trump was elected. Well, first of all, he lost the popular vote against Hillary Clinton. Let's not forget that. And then he was elected by a very small majority in a few states in the second time he won. So I'm not sure this huge rising anti-globalism as much as he's pushing that agenda. The US gave itself a lot of power in the beginning of the UN system, and then it kind of jumped away and said, oh, just kidding, we're not going to really get involved, or we're going to pull out of the refugee situation, the World Health Organization, and now today in the paper they're bragging that we've now basically gotten rid of all the environmental restrictions that there once were. I mean, to me, it's hard not to blame the current state of affairs on the current administration.
Well, and in my mind, and let me clarify, because I think there's a lot of blame. There's no doubt about it. And in my mind, I'm thinking in terms of a trajectory, it still looks to me like stagnation, maybe not dramatic rupture like we're seeing at every turn and we can hardly keep up with right now under the current administration. But I still see just bigger forces pushing toward really a stagnation, not an effort to move things forward, take on challenges in a meaningful way. So it wouldn't be identical, but I think as far as direction it's heading would not be a big shift. But I appreciate the pushback. And that's a piece of this that we'll be seeing. And it gets back to your question too. That sort of thing will be determinative a little bit of where this all ends up.
So a pretty clear theme throughout everything you told us tonight is that a lot of these treaties, a lot of the old order, if we want to call it that, was aspirational, ambiguous, and it stayed that way, it sounds like, in your mind, mainly to uphold state sovereignty. So the question is, does any new order that we create, can you create a functional one that works, that's long-standing, unless states truly give up a lot of their state sovereignty?
States have to give up some. They're always going to be reluctant to do so. What I wanted to get at in addressing that, I think, was broadly two things. One was what complicates this big question is you can't create an image that falls to the one extreme or the other. Because the one would say it was all aspirational nonsense. So we're not missing anything. We're just speaking the truth. And that's where Carney, I think, went a little too far in his remarks, sort of saying this was all a farce and we'll make it better. If you go too far the other way and don't acknowledge that, you say, wow, everything was working well and now it's just been knocked out of the way. It's complicated, incremental business. You've got competing interests, you've got huge concerns about sovereignty. So you always have to give up some. It's hard to get actors to give up much. And that's the framework in which all of this occurs. And that, to me, is what is the biggest danger of the ruptures we're seeing. That if you no longer are guided by aspirations and you're no longer trying to work out what are the bounds in which we can act, that's a difficult pathway because it's a much less stable world. It can be a more stable world even with the flaws that we see because of power disparities, because of sovereignty concerns, competing interests. But a world with some boundaries is far better than one that doesn't have those boundaries.
Let's thank Dr. Westra for leading us in this conversation. Thank you, Joel.
Thanks for a good conversation.
And we're choosing this particular topic to launch a new initiative with the Ford Presidential Foundation and Museum. And this Thursday at noon, we're going to invite those who want to come back to have more of a conversation over lunch about some of the topics we've just talked about. Erica, how can someone still get involved in that?
Yes, there's a little bit of a deadline. We'll close registration tomorrow at 10 a.m. just so that we have time to order lunches, but you can go to our website and register for the program on Thursday and the remaining two. They're free, so you just need to sign up and we'll see you there.
Great. We're excited to continue the conversation. Thanks to the Foundation Museum for that. Next week, we're going to be on the road again. We're going to have our next Great Decision series on Wednesday, the 18th. So we're coming off a Tuesday. We're going to do it on Wednesday. And we're going to do it at East Grand Rapids High School at 6 o'clock. The reason we're doing that is because we're delighted to have Ambassador Bridget Brink, the former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, come with us. She is a graduate of East Grand Rapids High School. They are helping us host this conversation with her. So that'll be fascinating. There probably aren't too many people who know more about the country than she. So next week, it's on Wednesday at 6 o'clock. At East Grand Rapids High School. And then we'll be back here for the rest of the series here at the museum. So thank you so much for attending. We appreciate it. Thank you for wanting to be world aware. We'll see you next week.